Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today my husband Sush and I are here to bring you a discussion of the 6 novels which are finalists for the Hugos this year, for the Hugo Novel category. We have already discussed the short stories, novelettes, and novellas that are eligible for Hugos this year, and I will link below videos where we discuss those, as well as a playlist for all of them together. So today we're going to discuss the novels, which is the last category that we are trying to read for and vote in. And we will do our best to not have spoilers, but we aren't always perfect about that, and we may go into a little bit more detail than some people prefer. So if you want to wait and watch this after reading those books, go ahead. I will have a list down in the comment section below of all of the different books that are in this category. And we are going to alternate talking about books. We're going to start with the ones that I have rated lowest, going to my highest rating, because Sush doesn't really rate books, so we're just going to go by my rating since I have numbers associated with them, and talk about some of the, what the story's about and some of the themes that we noticed and kind of our feelings about the different books.
And one of the things that I'll add this time is there's a heavy representation of audiobooks for me because I was trying to get stuff read in time. That is normally not something I try to do because I try to do fiction as a book and typically nonfiction as an audiobook. So slight variation in normalcy. Okay, first up is Space Opera by Catherynne M. Valente. And unfortunately, this is a book that I have not yet finished. And this was a conscious decision a little earlier to DNF. And then now I'm trying to see if I can get it read before the July 31st Hugo deadline. But I think even in that 8% that I initially read, I made up my mind about it. The primary idea behind this book is that it's kind of a Eurovision in space. Aliens appear on Earth, and basically, when humans first find out that they're not alone in the universe, they're also invited to represent Earth in a space music competition. And if you come in dead last, you will be wiped out. And so
like your entire planet.
Yeah. And basically the idea is that the fundamental decision that is trying to be made in this thing is what constitutes as people, that is sentience, and what constitutes as meat. And so basically...
Which is a theme in some of the other books in this category as well.
Exactly. It's something like what constitutes as being worth it in terms of identity is something we noticed in multiple books. And I felt other books did it better. So I know it's a little harsh, but that's what I wound up feeling. And I think the idea for me was it tries too hard to be Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
And I kind of wrote a piece. I'm going to just read it out. I have no way of remembering things. So basically, this is kind of my view of how the book reads. So here goes. By the time you've grokked the essence, the meaning, the impression, the arbitrary synonymous terms in the list, the sequence, the ordered items, that which when strung together one after another, not to belabor the point too much, the impression, the gravitas, the whimsy, the oh so well introduced contraindicator that proves the point, the arbitrary, or is it, grandioseness, the generosity of it all which speaks very well of your upbringing, the neurons that are firing in your brain right this very instant with the luminous streaks of aquamarine blue amidst the gelatinous green aura that some MRI tech somewhere might actually go ooh at, despite them being low on caffeine at the time, with their little grey cells chugging along quite nicely with the memory of Poirot twirling them his moustache, now that that comes to mind when you think of your little grey cells. You get the idea.
You wrote that?
I wrote that.
I had wondered why it was taking Sush so long to prep for making this video, but now I see.
I wanted to convey the impression.
That is exactly how the book read.
It's very colorful and the style is there, but then it's so difficult to parse, and as you're kind of going through it, you've lost the context. And if you try to blur out and just pay attention to the style and ignore what is actually being said, you miss out on what's going on. It is hard to read. So that's
I gave up. I mean, I read the first 2 chapters and then I was just way too annoyed. I thought that's exactly what the story sounded like. So I'm impressed by your mocking writing skills, but the story was just so. I mean, verbose doesn't even cut it. This is to colorful what like a psychedelic. Kaleidoscopic experiences to it's just so extreme in how I don't know in how funny it tries to be in its style that it's impossible to concentrate on the story, and I got fed up with it, and I read 2 chapters solely because I was trying to give it a fair shot, but I mean I was just fed up.
And that might be what it's going for, in that it is kind of like a punk rave Eurovision kind of a thing, but that doesn't work for me.
Exactly. So there could be people who read that and think this is so funny and like they love that style, and I'm sure that's why it's nominated, because there must be a lot of people who do like that style. But for me, it made it impossible to concentrate on the story at all. And what I've heard from some people too is that it's style over substance. So I'm not even sure that if I were to get past that writing style, there wouldn't be anything else there. So I DNF'd it. I don't give ratings to anything I DNF other than it's low on my list. So that was Space Opera. Next on the list is Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. And this is a post-apocalyptic urban fantasy. It's set in somewhat a near future after some great ecological disasters basically make a lot of the US uninhabitable. But the people of the Navajo Nation, before those disasters hit, had built up some walls to protect their nation, and that meant that they kind of are able to survive in this post-apocalyptic world. In addition to that going on the outside, inside of the Navajo Nation, some strange things have occurred because of this apocalypse, in that the magic and gods and powers of the classical Navajo culture have become real again. And so there's a lot of clan powers that are re-emerging. People are finding themselves having these inherited powers that are part of their tradition but haven't existed for generation upon generation. And the gods of their culture and history are coming to Earth and are causing havoc, and there's monsters. So the main character of this story is Maggie, and she has gone through a lot of trauma. She has watched bad things happen in front of her, and she's sort of alone now, dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress. And she's discovered that she has some very strong clan powers that allow her to fight against a lot of these monsters that are popping up. So she's this badass heroine who is able to fight against these monsters and protect her people, but she's also a little bit outcast because her clan powers are very violent and a lot of the other people in her community are afraid of her. She's very isolated and she's just dealing with a lot of mental health issues. So this story is a really cool story, but it's also one that delves into a lot of issues of sort of mental health and PTSD and kind of like dealing with emotionally unhealthy relationships and things like that as well. So I thought that the absolute coolest part about this story was the world building. The world building was so neat. It's so great to read something that is set in like an indigenous culture. I am not as familiar with Navajo culture, but I have read a number of stories of different tribes throughout the US, and one of the stories that I think really resonated with what was in this book is stories of trickster gods. So in the Pacific Northwest, for example, there's the Raven, and Raven is a trickster god. He both helps humanity and often harms humanity through his tricks. And in this story, there's Coyote, and Coyote is a trickster god. And so I really love that part. I loved that idea of gods who, you know, are tricksters, who you can't trust. That's a very cool thing. Just the idea of the types of magical powers, the types of gods, the types of monsters, that was all super fascinating. It was fascinating also just the way that people interacted, just their daily life type of culture, and the things that were valued. So a lot of that world building was really cool. There was also a great integration of Navajo language into the story. And not just integration, but I mean, there's a lot of words that were used that were Navajo words, and with text like symbols, alphabet letters, that were not things you normally see in an English alphabet. So for example, if you've read it, there's like an L with a little kind of bar through it, which is a chl. So it's kind of like this sound. I like that a lot, that they actually included that, and they included the tone markings, the kind of accent marks. They tell you if it's a high tone or a low tone, and all of those other sorts of things that linguistically I find really fascinating. So that was super cool that that was integrated, and it felt like a very rich culture. However, the opposite part of that is that it wasn't always explained. There were a lot of things that were introduced that I thought, oh, they're going to explain what's going on here, they're going to provide background or fullness of this story, and they were just never addressed. There was so much that was just sort of this half-addressed aspect of the culture, and like the post-apocalyptic nature of the story. They never actually explained what the apocalypse was. So there was just so much at the end of the story that I had been convinced I was going to be filled in on, and I never was. Admittedly, this is the first book in a series, so it's very possible that later books would address it, but I expected to have more filled in the first book. I expected if you're going to bring up something, you're going to provide a little bit more information on it. So that felt very incomplete and unsatisfying for me. The themes that have to do with Maggie and kind of her character and her emotional development and her dealing with PTSD, dealing with kind of loneliness and isolation and bad relationships, I found that to be also really good. Like that was a very enriching part of the story.
It's very well fleshed out,
right?
With details and
yeah,
like
and I mean,
waves and
she was dealing with PTSD, and she was a difficult character. She was having a lot of trouble connecting with people, a lot of trouble trusting people, a lot of trouble, you know, being close to anyone, and that makes her a difficult character, but it also made her really fascinating for me. On the other hand, there was also a lot of emotional drama, and like that part, it in some ways was justified or explained by the emotional difficulties she was having, but at the same time, sometimes it was just a little bit much for me. And similarly, the action in the story, I loved. There was so many cool things that happened, lots of really interesting action. I felt like the pacing of the book was really, really great throughout the first, you know, I would say 75%. But then at the end, it got a little too fast. It was sort of all of a sudden everything was happening, and the culmination of the story was too much for me. It was just everything all at once, tons of reveals, tons of massive epic battles, and nothing resolved. So it was just too much all at once. And even the action that happened throughout the book was a little violent for my taste. I always struggle with violence in books, and this definitely had that kind of, you know, Mad Max post-apocalyptic type feel, where it was violent and a little bit graphic in certain aspects, and that was a little bit much for me. So this book, I felt, had a lot of really great positives, but it also had certain things that were detractions for me. That lack of explanation of the world, and the kind of too fast-paced action at the end, some of the emotional drama, those things were all harder for me to be engaged with.
Yeah, I don't know that I have that much to add to that. There was, I mean, the Mad Max-like world with the, what do you say, Native American stories was a really neat setup. Loved the characters. And basically there's also this whole notion of, you know, why people are kind of the way, in terms of posturing or in terms of brashness or something like that, and then you kind of see behind the scenes for a lot of people. So it's really well done. And there's also this notion of, I think, cliffhangerness.
Yeah.
I think it was set up to continue on to book two, and I'm looking forward to book two. I will definitely read book two. But at the same time, I think if they had cut the story maybe another 10% before where the story ended and had this part of book two, I personally would have enjoyed it more. I think everything else you hit basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So overall, I gave this 3.5 stars out of 5. I think it has a lot to offer, but it's maybe not quite as much my style as some other books.
So next up is The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. And this was a really good book. So this book is kind of a prequel to a novelette. Was it novella? Novelette, I think?
I think it was a short story. There was a short story like The Lady Astronaut of Mars,
Correct.
Something like that. I have not read it actually.
Which won a Hugo in like 2014 or something like that. And so this is kind of a prequel to that.
Mm-hmm. The backstory.
The backstory. And basically the story roughly follows alternate history events after 1952. And the premise is, just like it's theorized that a meteorite crashes into the dinosaurs, a similar scale event happens in 1952. And so just as the Cold War is getting heated up and the space race is starting, the space race takes on a very different feel because you now have to survive to get off Earth, which is quickly not going to be habitable.
Yeah. There's going to be great changes in the weather patterns that will make Earth uninhabitable due to the way that the meteor hit the Earth and the size of it.
Mm-hmm. And the primary protagonist is this lady called Elma York, and she is the person who, she's a WASP, Women Air Force Special Pilot, who had served in World War II. And
she's also like a genius. Like,
yeah.
She's really, really intelligent, excellent at math and physics, just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. And she's a calculator, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And if you're unfamiliar with the term calculator as a profession, I highly recommend the movie Hidden Figures, and I assume maybe there was a book behind it too?
I think there's also a book behind it. Yeah.
But the movie was brilliant, and in my mind, that movie informed a lot of the backdrop and visuals for me as I was reading this book. And so basically, the one part of the story is this whole, okay, we need to get off Earth.
Yeah.
Okay? But the other part of the story, and I would argue the primary thrust, is the casual sexism and racism that is just everyday and normalized.
Yeah, so not just how do we advance science such that we can become a spacefaring people, but also how do we advance our society such that women and people of various races are able to contribute and be a part of these efforts.
And it's kind of like that is, I would say, the primary thrust of the story, where Elma, who is actually the person who discovered that, oh wait, this meteorite crash is, a humanity-ending thing, is still on the sidelines of the mission to get people off Earth. Okay, she has to fight every step of the way for inclusion and things like that. And so that, I think, is the basis of the story. What is also interesting, I thought, was there's a common notion in terms of inclusive writing that you cannot speak for someone else's experience, and thereby you can't really portray them and that sort of a thing, right? And I think this book comes at it from a very interesting angle for me, where the primary character is Jewish, and she faces issues, microaggressions, and quite a few macroaggressions as well, as a result of her being a woman and as a result of her being Jewish. Okay, but at the same time, there are other people, African American friends of theirs, so to speak, for example, who do face quite a bit more, and she starts to realize and recognize, and she treats them with respect. And I think that is an interesting aspect of the story as well for me.
She treats them with respect, but she isn't always starting from a point of awareness.
Correct. And I think that movement into awareness is something I really liked. And so it doesn't have to be that, no, you have to write characters of color or write characters that are queer and things like that. It's the ability to, even for authors that do not belong to minority communities, to basically make them visible, I think was kind of neat. And it's not always perfect.
I also think, I'm pretty sure that Mary Robinette Kowal is not Jewish.
That's fair.
So it is interesting. I mean,
Yes.
there is part of that where she has created a character who is not part of a minority group that she belongs to.
Yeah.
But there's also this idea of, the story really is told from Alma's perspective. It's not told from the other people's perspectives, but there are very strong supporting characters who are Chinese or Black or, facing a lot of other types of discrimination that the main character isn't facing, even though she is facing a lot of challenges too. And so it's that exploration of, everybody has their own kind of burdens that they deal with.
Yeah. And this brings a certain amount of view of intersectionality in a 1950s setting, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is. So it also has a focus on mental health too.
It does, yeah. So that I found to be really interesting. There's also a thing which I really liked, which is a bit about the term lady astronaut itself, where the primary character doesn't like it. And I thought this was a little bit of author's voice kind of poking in after the success of the previous book, maybe. Yeah. So there's a lot of really neat things in the book. There's a lot of good topics that are explored. The view of PR and messaging and things like that. It's a solid book. I will also mention that I started reading this as an audiobook, and I quickly switched over to reading the text version of it, because the voice that was used in the audiobook came off a little bit too whiny. And I think that works in that the character has cause to be whiny and to be passive aggressive and things like that. But it sounds very different in my head than it did in the audiobook.
Yeah, so one of my biggest issues with this book was that I had a hard time connecting to Alma. Like that was difficult for me, because I found that I had listened to the audiobook because I'd heard that it was narrated by Mary Robinette Kowal, and I thought, oh, this will be excellent. And I read this book last year. I had been attempting to try out audiobooks, and that experiment taught me that I don't like fiction on audiobooks. I had listened to a couple of different audiobooks, and in general I struggled to connect as much with the characters. I think audiobooks tend to be slower than I read when I'm just reading normally, and I don't really like listening to them sped up. And the narrator will often put an interpretation on the character that isn't necessarily the way that I would interpret them just reading on my own. And so for this audiobook especially, I struggled to connect, and I struggled really in particularly with anything that I interpreted as passive aggressive, because that's not something that I am able to empathize with as much. And Alma has a lot of scenes where people are just being complete jerks to her. And her response is this southern, kill them with kindness, So internally she's thinking, you are so wrong, and I disagree with you so strongly, and I can't stand you. And then externally she's saying, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And it just, oh my gosh. Yeah, you understand. Like that super sugary sweet voice especially really got to me. So there were certain issues with that I just struggled to connect with. And I think that part of the issue was that I listened to it on audio, where I just didn't realize at that point that audiobooks don't work for me so well for fiction. I really kind of wish that I had reread this as an ebook, because that might have changed my opinion a bit. Like I might have liked it a bit more. But my experience last year reading it on audio, I just struggled to connect a bit.
Also, speaking of audiobooks, I forgot to mention, Trail of Lightning was particularly good as an audiobook.
Which I did not listen to as an audio.
And given that I'm not as linguistically aware of various other writing systems, that really helped me get a lot of the names and things like that much more easily. So.
Yeah. So for Calculating Stars, I think that it does such a great job of talking about inclusion. It does a great job of presenting a science fiction story which feels very close to reality. It feels very much like this is something that could have happened and this is the way that the science would have proceeded. So there's nothing fantastical about this science fiction. It's very based in reality, and there's a lot of focus on, real science, talking about how weather patterns are going to be changed because of the impact of the meteor. It's talking about kind of a lot of things that are to do with, okay, well, what sort of resources do we have and how do we make this work? And it's just very grounded in reality, and that's a very cool type of science fiction. And that reimagining of a history where we become more inclusive and there's more social justice focus early on. Early on, a couple decades ago, right? Yeah. So a lot of that was super cool. But as I said, I struggled a bit to connect. So for me, this was a 4-star read. Next up is Record of a Spaceborn Few by Becky Chambers. This is the 3rd book in the Wayfarers series. And this book focuses on the Exodus Fleet, which is a group of spaceships, like generation spaceships, of humans who left Earth when Earth kind of collapsed, had ecological disasters and collapsed. And they've been traveling in space for generations and generations, and they've created this very unique culture. Because they have these very isolated systems on their generation ships, they've created a very communist or socialist type of society where everybody contributes, everybody is guaranteed to have housing and food and things like that. There's a barter system as kind of their economy, because a lot of it is just guaranteed, like you will just get food, and then past that you would use bartering. Everybody contributes, so there's a lot of focus on being part of your community, having shared values. So this is sort of the history of the Exodus Fleet. But in the past few decades before this story occurs, the Exodus Fleet has been integrated into the sort of more wider galaxy of sapient beings, and they've been kind of allowed into that government. And there are a lot of other cultures and a lot of other races and beings that are part of that. And now this system is no longer closed. Instead of being isolated, they have a lot more contact with the outside. And a lot of this book is focusing on how they deal with maintaining their culture while also interacting with those outside, and how that requires adaptation. So there's so many questions in this book about belonging and adaptation that I thought were really fascinating. In general, I think the themes of this book are the strong points. There are so many very fascinating themes. So the big one really is this idea of community and belonging. What does it mean to be part of the Exodus Fleet? What does it mean to be part of a community where everybody is working together, where everything that you do affects everybody else because it's this closed system? And what does it mean when that system opens up and you have to deal with these outside influences that start changing your culture? Because in the Exodus Fleet, they've had these generations and generations of people who are following the same rituals and the same patterns and the same values. And suddenly within a generation, they've got new values. And you've got people who are dealing with things like their kids are not just speaking their home language, but are starting to pick up some of the slang and terms that are used in the kind of like international language, or they want to do things that are cool, like play video games or have outfits or things like that that are part of the foreign culture. And they don't necessarily want to stay at home anymore. They want to go and they want to explore these new places. And so that's very hard for a lot of the families to deal with. At the same time, there's issues of non-Exodus people coming into the fleet. So one of the main characters is a kid whose family used to be Exodus, but they left a long time ago, many generations ago. And he grew up on a different world, and he's decided that he wants to go to the fleet and try living there. But when he goes, he doesn't fit in. And there's a lot of issues of, he wants so badly to be part of this, but he's seen as an outsider by the Exodans. And even though the Exodans are such a close-knit community and so accepting and all this sort of stuff, not so much of outsiders, because it's almost like a threat to their culture. So there's so many issues of community and belonging in this. There's also just a lot of issues of that kind of adaptation and how that affects them, and are they going to lose their culture? Is their culture going to be corrupted? There's a big focus on values and ritual and history. That's a big part of this. Some of the main characters are people who are in charge of maintaining those aspects of their community. So one of the main characters is a historian, and she's in charge of the record keeping. And another of the main characters is an undertaker, and she's in charge of the death rituals and ceremonies. And both of these women are really heavily involved in a lot of ceremonies, like a naming ceremony for newborn babies that the historian is involved in, and kind of funerals and things like that that the undertaker is involved in. So there's this big focus on how do you maintain your culture? How do you maintain your rituals and your values? And when is it time to kind of be okay with those changing? And what does it mean to change? So there's so many really fascinating themes that are explored in this book.
I think actually that is very key, because this whole notion of rebirth is very big in the book. The whole birth and death cycle and kind of reintegration and recycling, sustainability kind of a thing is a huge part of the book. There's also this thing where as part of their rituals, they kind of reaffirm their values in a sense.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that is kind of like a very constant theme in a lot of things as well. So in general, I found the society really fascinating. It is a society that is set up to self-sustain. Mm-hmm. And because when they left Earth, they didn't know anything else was out there. And they wanted to kind of survive and continue that survival. But then when you have that kind of a community that has set up for self-sustaining as a closed system, it comes in contact with something else, then expectations are kind of opened out. And it's kind of interesting from that perspective. Mm-hmm. The concept of identity, of what beings matter, is something, and pride in whether you matter or not is also a theme that
Yes.
gets explored a lot over here.
Yeah. Again, like we had mentioned in space opera, mm-hmm. that's a theme in this book, and it's actually explored really interestingly.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of themes, I thought this book was phenomenal.
I did too.
And
so the themes were the strength of this book, and they were excellent. I mean, they were really great. It's this exploration of what it means to be human, really. So those were so moving. I mean, just so moving. I totally, both of us cried. Yeah. We both cried. And it, just tears streaming down. It's so moving and beautiful. The part of this book that was not quite so great is the structure. So the way that the book works is it's sort of this patchwork quilt type of story where there's a bunch of different people with different stories that become intertwined. However, when the book starts, the first 20%, all you're getting is these very, very, very separate stories. So there's many characters. I forget how many main characters there are, but something like 5 or 6. Yeah. So there's like 5 or 6 separate stories, and they're super separate in the beginning. You cannot see anything that connects them. And then when you start to get to like the 30-40% mark, they start coming together and you start seeing how they build a single cohesive story. And around the midway point, it becomes this super engaging, really beautiful, complex story. And then at the end, it sort of all separates out again and you follow the separate characters as they kind of go their way. It's almost like having 20% of the book be epilogue.
Yeah, it felt like that. So it was sort of like the main thrust of the story was over.
Yeah.
And then you kind of follow on each of those characters to their logical conclusion of what they were struggling with or what they were seeing it, and basically to wrap up the story. And that felt unnecessary, and it detracted from the story rather than adding to it. I mean, I get that some of the theme explorations that were being attempted got resolved in those periods, but at the same time that felt unnecessary.
Yeah, and I think Sush had also mentioned, like, it felt like it wrapped up a little too neatly.
Yes. So I have not read book 2 of the series. I've read book 1 and then straight to book 3. And to me, it felt like book 3 could have been a standalone, except that it spoils a bit of book 1. But if you look at the story structure of book 1, it was a series of stories which were happening in chronological order. Okay, and each story wrapped up really nicely. And that really got to me, and I was a little, I felt like it was too saccharine sweet. And it was like really good characters in the middle of a world that is not exactly great. And things kept wrapping up really nicely, and that frustrated me. This book, I thought, dealt with those kinds of issues a lot better because it introduces a lot of moral gray, and it handles, difficult situations a lot better. And it was really, really powerful, really, really good. And then in the end, it started wrapping things up neatly again. And I was just, that last 10-20%, I think, it was powerful, but I don't know, it didn't work for me.
Yeah, I think in general, for both of us, it's one of those, if you cut out the first 20 and the last 20%, this is like an excellent book. But with those in it, it just kind of, it detracted from the story for us. So overall, I gave it 4.5 stars. I think it had a lot to offer, but that disjointedness at the beginning and at the end didn't really work.
Next up is Revenant Gun by Yoon Ha Lee. And this was a phenomenal book. It is book 3 of a series. And I was trying to summarize, it was really, really hard to talk about anything without spoiling things. And so I really struggled with trying to come up with stuff about it. But there is plenty of stuff to say which still doesn't spoil it. So I will stay mostly in the themes and not so much about what happens or anything like that in the book. In fact, I got to a point where I looked at the blurb of the book and I thought that had spoilers. So.
Yeah, it's like unlike Record of a Spaceborn Few, where that almost is completely separate from the first 2 books in that series. This book is much more like part 3 of a single story.
Yep. So, things that I will talk about. Firstly, the name of the book, Revenant Gun. In terms of themes, I really like the name of the book because it's about things that won't stay down. Okay, be it notions of how to govern or things like basically difficult stuff, messy things about the universe and interpersonal relationships and themes of things like abuse and whatnot that won't stay down. Okay. What is also interesting is there's a line which goes, "I'm your gun," which is often repeated in the book. And that notion of basically offering yourself up as a service for someone else to use is also something that comes up again and again. And therefore the name Revenant Gun, to me, was a really powerful name. Okay. Also, I wound up going through Goodreads reviews to try and figure out what have other people said about this, which is not a spoiler. And I particularly like one review that I have a small section of.
Sure.
And funnily enough, this review was by Seth Dickinson of Baruch Covenant fame. And he called it, he likened the book to a gun, which is compact, mean, loud at the end, and willing to leave you with a lot of debris and wounds to examine after it's all over.
Yeah.
I think
that's
that's
that's the book.
that's the book. If you want a summary of the book, that is it.
That is so true. I only finished this book last night, and I'm like still recovering from it. It is messy, and there's so much to process, and it's powerful, it's impactful, but it is intense, and there's a lot demanded of you as the reader.
In terms of powerful books, this is in a league of very few.
Yeah.
Other things that I will mention about the book is the first book in the series had a primary viewpoint character and maybe a couple of other viewpoints thrown in to flesh it out. Book 2 had like 2 or 3 viewpoint characters, and it kind of explored things interestingly. This book introduces many more viewpoints. And I think there's a lot more diversity of viewpoints in this third book. And it really, really works.
I really liked the characters that we got as viewpoints for this book. My favorite was, I've mentioned to Sush before, my favorite was Hemiola, who is a servitor, so sort of like a robot. I loved Hemiola. Hemiola was so earnest and so, just really wanting to do the right thing, wanting to fulfill its obligations, wanting to try its hardest, and just that character was so sweet. I really loved it. And I also just loved the insight into the servitors. Even throughout the first and second book, there is a bit about the servitors, about the robots and their sort of culture. But this book really expanded on that, and I loved it.
And one of the things that I will bring there in terms of connect to themes is themes of loyalty.
Yeah.
Okay. So the series as a whole explores many, many different themes of loyalty, and I think that got furthered in this book. There's 2 kinds of loyalties broadly. One is a notion of loyalty in a military faction called the Kell, where you kind of are almost like, military loyalty, right? But there's also this notion of people many of them can't help but be loyal, but some of them can help that, and that is in itself something that disconnects them from the rest of the Kell. And so basically
a lot of issues just about belonging and about when belonging is a choice versus not a choice, and when you don't conform to things, that being something that might ostracize you.
And so there's this notion of being Kell, where you can't help but be loyal, versus choosing to be loyal, and that is not being Kell in itself. And so the notion of identity is kind of really brought up again and again.
Yeah.
And then outside of the Kell itself, there's so many different kinds of loyalty. There's loyalty to people, there's loyalty to a memory of a person, there is loyalty to an idea, there's loyalty to history, and it's like there's so many different themes and types of loyalties that I explored, and in general of connections. And I thought the book was phenomenal.
And sometimes contrasting loyalty and obedience.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the themes in this book were very, very complicated. Very powerful, very complicated. Nothing was clean cut. Everything was complicated and very problematic choices. There were no good choices. Every choice was sort of a bad choice. And it's sort of, which bad choice do you make and why do you make it? And you're given the perspective of so many people who are making different sides of those choices, but very earnest in their belief of why they're making those choices. And so you see them on these opposing sides trying to fight for what they believe in and believing so strongly. And it's just, I mean, I guess it's, I was talking to Sush about this the other night, and it reminds me a lot of the whole North and South Korea thing, where you have people who are divided, who were basically, one one group of people, and then they're divided based on belief system and kind of political choices. But that division is painful. That division is something that keeps families from each other, that keeps people from connecting. And even though there's strength of belief in the choices that people have made, there's also pain from having felt like you had to separate because of those choices. So I think that I see a lot of Korea in this series, although I could just be imagining it there. Like maybe it's not intentionally, but I see so much about Korean culture, about that focus on loyalty, the focus on belonging, the focus on conformity, and so there's a lot of really interesting themes there.
And also there's, in terms of representation, I think there's a fair number of queer characters. Yes. And a fair number of gender-morphic characters, and this is just normal and across the board. And that's and yet there are still weird issues still going on. Yeah,
all of the sex in this book was really messed up. So like the things about gender, the things about sexuality, yes, those are all fine, but the actual sex is almost always really not healthy. Yep. Like lots of weird power dynamics, lots of weird kind of abusive situations, lots of consent issues. Yes. So there's a lot of weirdness revolving around sex in this book that was not my taste, but a lot of it was not, I think a lot of it was designed to talk about that weirdness. Like a lot of it was designed to talk about the mental health issues that were surrounding these people.
And now, as you mentioned this, I'm remembering a quote. I have no idea who by or what the context was, so this is, I don't know how it's going to go, but I think there was something on the lines of, everything is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. And that sort of a quote I feel like could really be applied about this. I mean, well, not the first bit, but the sex being about power, really about messed up power is huge in this book. And on that note, if you can't make out already, this book has a ton of trigger warnings associated with it, and it's
so many. There's so much abuse. There's so much trauma. It's a heavy book.
It's a heavy book. So yeah, that's definitely a big theme. I thought the characters were crazy wonderful. I thought the world building was really, really phenomenal. I thought that basically the magic system continues to be neat.
But it's hard to say if it's magic or science. I mean, it's kind of, it's that fantastical sci-fi. So it is a little...
And there's so much that goes really, really well with this book. The one criticism that I would have for it is I felt like the story arc wasn't really there. In a lot of stories, you have this whole setup, development, reveal kind of a thing, and I felt like that didn't really happen. There was definitely mystery. It was definitely hugely engaging, and I couldn't put it down. But the notion of I was just there along for the ride. A story was being told to me. I was not a participant in the story. That, I think, fell a little short for me. A lot of Deus Ex Machina kind of aspects. But the fact that does not detract from the enjoyment of it is also an endorsement of how good this book was.
I think for me, I didn't feel that lack of a storyline as much. I think for me, I felt this building mystery. It was very mysterious. There's just so much going on and you don't have insight into it. And you're seeing all of these different characters' perspectives, and it's not like any of them has a full picture, and it's not like you as the reader have any sort of full picture. But you're uncovering pieces and little bit by little bit, understanding a little bit more of the world. The political intrigue and the military strategy, those are all fascinating. It was a very action-packed, and like Sush said, sometimes it's a little bit, you're just along for the ride, and there's some Deus Ex Machina where just sometimes stuff that's so fantastical would happen that it's a little intense. So I felt like, you know, rather than feeling there was no plot, for me, I just felt like it was overwhelming in how much happened. There was just thing after thing after thing after thing. And that always is a struggle for me. But again, it's one of those ideas of, even though that's something that normally would be problematic for me, the story was just so good that it was fine. I still think that this was an excellent story, even though I had, like, I feel like I almost just need a week to process this book.
When I read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, the next book I read was this book called Gentle Swedish Art of Death Cleaning or something like that. And it was this old lady going about cleaning her home to make sure that she's not overburdening her, kids and things like that after she dies. And that was just such a huge mental cancel for me that I DNF'd it. And I needed time to process after that book. I think I felt the similar kind of needing time to process after I finished this book.
Yeah, it is emotionally impactful. And I think that the themes of trauma and abuse, to me, are the heart of this story. And that's a hard thing. It's a hard thing when trauma and abuse are the main parts of the story. And there's so much about kind of mental health and about dealing with trauma and abuse and dealing with isolation and dealing with, especially as somebody who has been abused, you know, that relationship you have with your abuser, because sometimes that abuser is not only somebody that you hate, but also somebody that you love. And that's very complicated. And sometimes people who are abusers have been abused in the past as well. And so that kind of perpetuation of abuse, the complicated emotions revolving around abuse, the mixture of sex with abuse and power, and it is a very complicated emotional book, while also being this intense sci-fi. And so there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to this story. I think that it is really, really a great book. I feel like I could have almost I could have handled this trilogy being stretched out to a much larger series, though, because there was just so much in it. So overall, I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Obviously, there's a couple of little things that were problematic for us, but the things that were strong were so strong that it still made it a 5-star book for me. And the last book that we have to talk about is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. So this book is a fairy tale, and it is inspired by Rumpelstiltskin. It is set in sort of a medieval Russia, but there's magical elements interwoven into this world. So this story focuses mainly on 3 young women. The first is Miriam, and Miriam is a Jewish moneylender's daughter. The second is Wanda, who is a poor farmer's daughter. And the third is Irina, who is a duke's daughter. And all 3 of them are dealing with a world which is very much not set up in their favor. And they all have to try to gain some sense of self-determination in order to protect their loved ones and their country. The main thrust of the storyline is that Miriam, as this moneylender's daughter, develops a skill in money lending where she makes a lot of really wise investments and she starts earning a lot of money. And this sort of is seen as turning silver into gold. Now, in this world, there are a magical group of people, sort of like winter frost fairies, called the Starik. And the king of the Starik hears of Miriam's ability to turn silver into gold and decides that she needs to literally turn silver into gold for him. And so he sort of kidnaps her and makes her try to turn rooms of silver into gold with magic. And she's not a magical person, so this is a pretty big challenge for her. As a side effect of this, it causes a lot of winter. So there's a lot of kind of overpowering winter that is making lives very difficult and endangering everybody in the country. So that's kind of the storyline. But I think that the two things that really stand out to me about this story are the beauty and absolute loveliness of the atmosphere and the writing. So the whole story, you just have this amazing feeling of being immersed in a winter, winter kind of wonderland almost. It's just this fantastic, magical place where strange and dark things can happen, where it's snowing and it's cold and you just feel that. The writing style itself is such a fairy tale style. I love the style of fairy tales, and this really worked for me. I loved the way it was written.
Power of threes and all those kinds of things.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so there's a lot of aspects. It feels very much like a fairy tale, but there are also just tons of modern themes. So the themes in this are very feminist. I found this to be a very feminist type of fairy tale, where the main focus of these three women is gaining control of their lives and their destinies. So all three of them come from families where they are disempowered. So Miriam comes from a family where her father is a moneylender, but he's very, very bad at it because he's super sweet and kind-hearted, and he doesn't want to make anybody pay if it's inconvenient for them. And she's living in kind of extreme poverty, and finally she decides that this is not how she wants to lead her life. And she takes control and she says, you know what, I'm taking over. I'm going to now be the moneylender, and I'm going to make this work. And she empowers herself. She decides that she's going to change their situation, and she does, and she becomes extremely good at it. Similarly, Wanda, the farm girl's daughter, her father is just this abusive, selfish, really awful human being that terrorizes their family. And Wanda decides that she's not going to let that happen anymore, and she's going to take control, and she's going to protect her family. And so she has two brothers that she decides she's going to look out for, and she's going to make a safe and healthy and loving environment for them, which they have never known. And she just decides that that's what she's going to do, and she does it. The third person, Irina, she's the daughter of a duke, and she's very much ignored. She kind of fades into the wallpaper. You know, she's not important. And she's kind of happy with that. She doesn't really want to be noticed. But then she is noticed by the Tsar, and she becomes the Tsar's wife. Not really by her choice, but it just happens. And as the Tsarina, she decides that, you know what? No, I have faded into, the background for so long. But now I'm the Tsarina, and the Tsar is like this awful person who is just very selfish and very destructive and is making a lot of choices that cause bad things to happen in the country. And she decides, no, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to look out for the well-being of my people. And so all three of these women go through this development of their characters and strengthening of their position and just self-empowerment. They decide that they are going to be self-determined in the way that their future plays out. And so I think that that's like a really awesome part of this story. I absolutely loved that. I also really liked the magic system. So one of the big themes of this book is debt and obligation. So Miriam is a moneylender, and debt is a big part of this book, but it's not just part of it in the real world, it's very much part of it in the magic system. So the Starik, the frost fairies, their whole magic system works on this idea of fair value. You can't give something away for free. The other person will owe you. And when you negotiate, it has to be for fair value. So the Starik king has kind of abducted Miriam and decided that she needs to change all of the silver into gold, but in return there has to be fair value paid to her. And so there's a lot of this negotiation and idea of what is fair value. There's also just ideas of what obligations do you have to your family, your country, your community, people around you, versus, what obligations and debts do they have to you? And how do you make sure that people fulfill those? One other thing that I really, really liked about this story that has to do with the way it was told is that it's told in the first person from multiple people's perspectives. So there's the three main women, but then there's also a couple of other side characters that you hear from, and every part of this book is told in the first person, but with really different voices. So I know that some people struggled with this when they read it, but for me, within one or two sentences, I could easily tell who the narrator was at that point because they had such distinct voices, and that really made me feel like I understood the characters. They felt so unique and so different to me, and their perspectives were so different, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the book.
For me, most of what you said, all this, I'm just nodding away. Not nodding away in terms of sleeping, agreeing. But also one of the things that for me I remember is this notion of money lenders in society and how they're viewed, and especially because I think Christian people were not allowed to collect interest or something of that sort.
That's exactly
and
right.
therefore money lending became a Jewish thing. I think that is explored in a sense of what a money lender's place in a village is and how they are pariahs while they enable things. And then the question of identity also wraps itself really strongly into that. So for me, reading this book is something kind of like a three-course meal, so to speak, where I would put, say, Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare as the first course for one view, Ivanhoe by Raleigh, was it?
Something like that, yeah.
As the second course, and this as the third.
Yeah.
And kind of like compare and contrast view of Jewish characters between these things is actually very interesting. Or view of money lenders in specific.
Yeah, actually, another part that was really big on this story was ideas of kind of anti-Semitism, classism, sexism, and just these ideas of prejudices against people and unfair treatment. Really, I mean, I think it probably comes back to this idea of fairness. You know, we have
fair value.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
So there's this whole idea of fair value in terms of the trading and negotiation and everything that happens with the magic system. But there's also an idea of a fair treatment of people, fair treatment of women, fair treatment of different religious backgrounds, fair treatment of different classes of people. You know, and there's that Wanda who's basically the bottom of society and Irina who's basically the top of society, right? And so there's so much in here about fair treatment that I thought it was just really excellent in terms of themes. In terms of how much I loved this book really ranks for me kind of among the top books of a decade for me. I don't know that I had anything about this book I didn't like. I just loved this book. I loved being immersed in this story, in this world. I loved the characters. I loved the way that the fairy tale world was built. I loved the magic system. I loved the themes explored. It was so powerful and wonderful and just very much up my alley. You know, I struggle sometimes with things that are a little bit more violent or darker, but I like how they address interesting themes. For this one, it addressed so many of those themes while still staying kind of beautiful. Like, you know, it didn't get into that darkness while still addressing some complicated issues, and that really worked for me. I just felt joy while reading this book.
There was darkness in a way of a dark fairy tale.
Yes.
There wasn't darkness in terms of a bloody violent movie.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I think there are different kinds of darkness, and this really worked for me.
Yeah, it's not like sweet and wholesome in the way that maybe some of the Becky Chambers books are, but it has just this beauty. And I think this is probably the only book that I have ever finished and then immediately reread. So I don't think I've ever done that with a book before, but for this one, I finished the book and then I thought, Sush needs to read this immediately. And so I read it out loud to him.
Not immediately, but Murderbot.
Oh, Murderbot I did also reread to you afterwards. Yeah, that was a couple months afterwards. But for Spinning Silver, I think I finished it, and then like the next day I started rereading it to you. Yeah, so I absolutely love this book. I give it 5 out of 5 stars, and this is just my favorite of the lot. Okay, so that is a very long-winded wrap-up of our thoughts on the 6 novels that are eligible for the Hugo Novel category this year. We thought it was a great selection of books. I mean, really, the quality of the books that have been nominated is so high. Just like with the novellas, there's just so much that these stories offer that really I'm going to be happy to see anything win. Obviously, we've got our own rankings, our own preferences, but these are really, really good books. If any of you have read these books, please go ahead, comment down below, tell us what you thought, what you liked. If you are going to be voting for the Hugos, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that, or if you're doing videos on that, would love to hear about it and watch it. We are very excited. We have just a couple more days until voting. I think we're both kind of trying to squeeze in a little bit of the comic books as well, so we might vote in that, but we're not going to make a video about it. So we're really excited. We're also going to be in Dublin for Worldcon in August, so if you're going and we haven't already talked about that, please let us know down in the comments below, because it'd be great to say hi while we're there.